94.3 The Dude is very grateful to our men and women in uniform. We're proud to recognize local members of our military by turning the spotlight on them right now in our Soldier Salute.
I'm your host, Sergeant First Class Retired Don Sorensen, and on today's Soldier Salute, we're talking with Captain Lyle Rivers of the South Carolina Army National Guard. Captain Rivers, tell us about yourself.
Don, first of all, my name's Lyle, so please feel free to call me that. I'm South Carolina native, born and raised. Lived outside of the state for just a little while during my adult life, but really pride myself on being a South Carolinian. I like to say I'm a little country, a little bit rock and roll. Was raised early on in Chesterfield, South Carolina, out in the country on a family farm, and went through elementary school there, and then for my middle and high school years, grew up in Myrtle Beach down on the south end and graduated from Socastee High School, went on to the Citadel from there. After 4 years in Paradise, there in Charleston, South Carolina, went on to serve in the active component of the United States Army. Did an initial stint there in the active component, about 4 years, and decided to pursue some other interest in corporate America. I left the service, and when I left it completely. I went into what's called the inactive ready reserve, but that's where my name was on a scroll. If Uncle Sam needed me, he could call me. Otherwise, I was out of uniform service. So I pursued my civilian career for 12 years, but I still had that itch to serve. Got married shortly out of college. We started having a family after I left service. My wife knew that deep desire to serve our country remained. It became a point in our lives where I approached her about resuming service in a part-time fashion. My wife was very supportive of that.
Lyle, many of our guests go through basic training. However, you went through the ROTC, or Reserve Officer Training Corps.
That's right, Don, I did. A lot of folks don't realize at the Citadel that only about 20 to 30% of every class, the overwhelming majority of any number of graduates from a particular class, do not go into the military. I decided a little bit early on in my Citadel experience, knowing that every Citadel cadet is required to take an ROTC, whether it's Army, Navy, or Air Force. You're not required to contract, but you are required to take an ROTC. I decided to take Army ROTC. I grew up in the woods in elementary school, and so when I went out playing, I couldn't go play Air Force and couldn't go play Navy. I played Army. That's why I decided to take Army ROTC as an elective. But what I found when I really got into the curriculum is how much I really liked it. And at that point in time, it was the end of my freshman year, in fact, that I decided, you know what? I think I want to pursue this as a career.
Lyle, most of our listeners are familiar with the role that the South Carolina Army National Guard plays, but your unit has a unique role, doesn't it?
Don, it does, and you're right. We're usually seen serving in times of hurricanes, floods, ice storms. That's when the civilian population around South Carolina see the National Guard in action. What folks don't see is when National Guard soldiers are deployed to various contingency operations around the world. My unit in the Air Defense Artillery world, we have a really unique mission. We actually guard the skies around the national capital region. We are there right after 9/11 occurred. We recognized that we needed an additional type of response other than quickly scrambling F-16s. So that's when the president at that point in time called upon the National Guard to start fulfilling that role of providing air defense around the White House and around the Capitol building and the Pentagon as well. It is a mission that only the National Guard can fulfill constitutionally. We know that it puts strains on the civilian employer, just like it strains the National Guard. I have a firm appreciation for the civilian support and employee support of those soldiers who are constantly having to kind of step out of their civilian role, then plug back into it for a little while. It's got to be incredibly difficult. And I think that's one of the things that makes our National Guard soldiers so extremely unique and special. Most people would be shocked at where all throughout the world we have South Carolina National Guard soldiers deployed right now.
Lyle, there's got to be a lot of stress with being deployed and knowing that your family's back home dealing with problems and issues. How do you handle that?
I really didn't have a whole lot of stress going on, being concerned about my family back home. And I test that to the strength of my wife. We're a little bit unique in that my second deployment and the most significant deployment, she and I had been married for 17 years. Having that mature marriage, that mature relationship was really beneficial for me and her, quite frankly. And what she did to minimize the distractions for me, which she thought was absolutely critical. And keep in mind, I'm in Afghanistan, and back home I have a daughter in 8th grade, a son in 5th grade, and a daughter in preschool. So it's not like there's nothing going on back here. We all know how dramatic middle school years are. My wife, the only thing she ever communicated to me while I was over there and we had the opportunity to talk was all the great things that the kids were doing back here. Was I naive enough to believe that only great things were going on back here? Absolutely not. But she knew that I had enough stress going on being in a combat zone, trying to take care of my soldiers and accomplish missions, that she was not going to distract me with things that I couldn't impact anyway. They're going on thousands of miles away. How could I possibly affect my son potentially not getting enough playing time on the soccer field, or my daughter having trouble with math? She took care of those things, but it was because she realized that it would only be a distraction to me and that I really couldn't affect change in any way on those things, being thousands of miles away, having a job where I needed to be extremely focused. She shielded me from those things going on back here.
Lyle, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, has come to be associated with veterans and veteran causes. As a combat veteran yourself, what are your thoughts on PTSD?
Every veteran who has ever served in any generation has experienced post-traumatic stress. Unfortunately, it's just really with our generation that post-traumatic stress has been labeled as such and has become a clinical diagnosis. And I think it's so critical that people understand two people can experience the exact same stimulus, but our brains comprehend it differently and we respond differently. And I had such an experience on my deployment to Afghanistan. There were a lot of commercial aircraft that would come in and out making deliveries. I noticed that there was a big cargo jet taking off. Shortly after its wheels left the ground, it started climbing like it was a fighter jet. And I knew that wasn't right. Just moments later, it turned and the nose came down right into the ground. It was a massive explosion. What I did not realize at the time was how close 20 to 30 of my soldiers were. That plane went down 75 to 100 yards away from my motor pool. That's where I really came to appreciate how I could see something and experience it the same way as somebody right next to me and it have a profoundly different effect on our lives. And I think that that's something that not only the civilian population needs to understand, but also people in uniform need to understand and have an appreciation for other people's perspectives.
Lyle, have you gained any valuable life lessons from your military experience?
Don, I can definitely say yes to that. I will say, just outside even of just military life experiences, we very rarely can control what happens to us in life. But we have complete control over how we respond to what happens to us. The military is such a fluid environment. Things are constantly changing. And that's when we're in what we call a garrison environment, when we're at Fort Jackson, when we're at our armory during our regular training. But when you're in a deployed environment, that's when you really appreciate how fluid the military occupation is, because when it's us versus them gets a say-so in what we do. And we may have the best plan that we can possibly create, but we have a saying in the military that the best plan rarely survives first contact. And that contact being when you get into it with the enemy. That concept, that's where I've really learned to appreciate that lesson of let me control what I can. And my control comes in how I respond to all the stimulus going on around us.
Lyle, what do you say to a young man or woman out there today that's considering a life of service?
They may not even be considering a life of service. They may just be considering service, period. In the military ranks, I would say jump in with both feet, because if you don't, you'll always regret it. I know way too many of my classmates from the Citadel who did not go into the military today, 20, 21, 22 years later, who tell me they wish they had. The great thing about the military is you can go in for a short period of your life. You go in for a few years. And if it's not for you, you leave. But think about all the great things that you leave with. You leave with new experiences, experiences, new relationships, both of which in many cases are going to transfer over to very valuable civilian opportunities. And so for anybody who's considering military service at all, embrace the personal courage that I believe it takes to step into the unknown and absolutely go for it.
Thanks for joining us in our Soldier Salute, presented by Little Pig's Barbecue. Serving Columbia since 1963 with that bodacious buffet. By Lexington Guns and Shooting Range, veteran owned and operated. And by Love Plumbing, Air and Electrical. Love to help you love your home.